The George Floyd protests in Minneapolis-Saint Paul began in the U.S. state of Minnesota on May 26, 2020, as a response to the murder of George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American man who died on May 25 after Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds as 3 other officers assisted during an arrest. Civil unrest in Minneapolis, also referred to as the George Floyd riots, Minneapolis riots, and Minneapolis uprising, spilled over into St. Paul and other locations in Minnesota and quickly inspired a global protest movement against police brutality and racial inequality. The initial course of events in Minneapolis and St. Paul was soon overlooked as national media attention shifted elsewhere, but local residents and officials were left mired in the aftermath of historic unrest, property destruction, and racial reckoning. Over a 3-night period from May 27 to May 29, Minneapolis sustained extraordinary damage from rioting and looting, largely along a 5-mile stretch of Lake Street south of downtown, including the demise of the city's 3rd police precinct building, which was overrun by demonstrators and set on fire. At cost of $350 million, approximately 1,300 properties in Minneapolis were damaged by the rioting and looting, of which nearly 100 were entirely destroyed. Neighboring St. Paul suffered damages that totaled $82 million and affected 330 buildings, including 37 that were heavily damaged or entirely destroyed, mostly along the city's University Avenue business corridor. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz activated the Minnesota National Guard in response to the riots, which resulted in the largest deployment of its troops since World War II. By early June, violence in the Twin Cities metropolitan region had resulted in at least 2 deaths, 604 arrests, and upwards of $500 million in damage to approximately 1,500 properties. The second most destructive period of local unrest in United States history, after the 1992 Los Angeles riots. Violent riots in Minneapolis-Saint Paul over the death of George Floyd largely subsided after May 30, 2020. The community responded to the initial wave of unrest with an outpouring of donations, food drives, volunteer cleanup efforts, and public art installments. But the riots worsened local economic conditions and disproportionately impacted store owners and the city's most vulnerable residents, who were already impacted by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic in Minnesota. Many small business owners were unable to recover losses from looting and arson and found the rebuilding process was too slow, as available recovery funds were quickly exhausted. Minneapolis and St. Paul officials sought state and federal support for recovery efforts. Minneapolis also experienced a sharp increase in violent crime after Floyd's death that disproportionately affected black residents in the city. By early June 2020, a police abolition movement in Minneapolis sought commitment from public officials for a strategy to defund the city's police force. Local protests and unrest over Floyd's death broadened to other issues of racial injustice and continued into 2021 in the Twin Cities. Protesters still sought justice for Floyd and accountability for the 4 Minneapolis police officers deemed responsible for his death. An occupation protest at the intersection of East 38th Street and Chicago Avenue, where Floyd was arrested and died, also persisted into 2021. Local officials prepared for the possibility of continued unrest in 2021 as the first trial of the 4 Minneapolis police officers deemed responsible for Floyd's death was scheduled to start in March. The conditions that led to the uprising in Minneapolis were said to be the result of years of disinvestment and abandonment of the area around Lake Street in Minneapolis and city officials ignoring the needs of the community's black residents. By the beginning of the 21st century, Minneapolis was home to some of the largest racial disparities in the United States. The city's population of people of color and indigenous people fared worse than the city's white population for many measures of well-being, such as health outcomes, academic achievement, income, and home ownership, the result of discriminatory policies and racism over the course of the city's history. Racial disparity was described as the most significant issue facing Minneapolis in the first decades of the 2000s. By 2015, Homeownership rates in the Twin Cities were 75% for white families, but only 23% for black families, one of the largest disparities in the nation. By 2018, unemployment for blacks in Minnesota had reached a historic low of 6.9%. But it was still 3 times higher than the rate for whites. Though black residents made up just 6% of Minnesota's population, they were nearly 37% of the state's prison population in 2016. By the 2020s, generations of the city's black residents had been UNAB.